"Get this pauper away from the table," my daughter-in-law said, pointing at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong room. The entire dining hall fell silent. Even now, when I think back to that moment, I can still hear the faint clink of silverware stopping in midair. 60 guests turned to stare at me. Some looked confused. Others looked embarrassed. A few simply looked away. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 72 years old, a widow, a mother, and a grandmother. That night was supposed to be a celebration of family. Instead, it became the night my own family tried to erase me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand respect. I simply stood there beside the long dining table covered with white linen and fresh flowers, holding the small gift bag I had brought for my youngest granddaughter. The room smelled of roasted beef, garlic butter, and expensive wine. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over polished mahogany floors. Everything looked perfect. Everything except the way my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, was staring at me. Her expression carried the kind of confidence that only comes from believing you've already won. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," one of the security guards said quietly as he approached. He looked uncomfortable. I couldn't blame him. He was only doing what he had been told. I glanced across the room toward my son, Daniel. For a moment, I hoped he would stand up. I hoped he would tell everyone there had been a misunderstanding. I hoped he would remember that I was the woman who had raised him alone after his father spent years building a business that kept food on our table. Instead, Daniel lowered his eyes and reached for his water glass. That hurt more than anything Vanessa could have said. I nodded politely at the guard. "Of course," I replied. My voice sounded calm, even to me. The silence around the room seemed to deepen. Vanessa folded her arms. "This dinner is for family," she said, "not for people looking for handouts." A few guests exchanged nervous glances. Someone near the back coughed. Nobody laughed. Nobody agreed with her. But nobody challenged her either. I looked down at my simple navy blue dress. I'd driven nearly 80 miles from my small ranch that afternoon. I hadn't dressed to impress anyone. I had come because Daniel himself had called and invited me. He had said the family wanted me there. He had said everyone missed me. I suppose that was the first lie. The guard waited patiently beside me. I gave him a small smile and started walking toward the exit. The gift bag remained in my hand. Behind me, conversations slowly resumed. Forks touched plates again. Glasses clinked. The celebration continued as though nothing unusual had happened. As though a grandmother had not just been escorted away from her own family's table. I reached the front doors and paused. For a brief second, I turned back. Vanessa was laughing with a group of guests. Daniel sat beside her, staring at the tablecloth. Neither of them noticed me watching. Neither of them realized that tomorrow morning would change everything. They believed I was powerless. They believed the woman from the ranch had nothing left to offer. They believed they had successfully pushed me out of the picture. What they didn't know was that some of the most important decisions in the Whitmore family had never been made in that dining hall. They had been made years earlier. And the only person who knew the full truth was walking out the front door. I stepped into the cool evening air. The Texas sky stretched overhead, dark and endless. My old pickup truck sat alone in the parking lot beneath a street lamp. I took a deep breath, opened the driver's door, and climbed inside. Then my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Richard Coleman, my late husband's attorney. I answered. "Richard." There was a pause on the other end. Then he spoke quietly. "Eleanor," he said, "I was just informed about what happened tonight." I looked back once more at the glowing windows of the restaurant. Laughter drifted faintly into the night. "Yes," I said. "It seems my family had quite a celebration." Richard's voice hardened. "Then I believe it's finally time." For the first time that evening, I smiled. Not because I felt victorious. Not because I wanted revenge. But because I suddenly realized something important. They thought they had removed me from the table. In reality, they had just removed themselves from the future they had been counting on. The drive back to my ranch took a little over an hour. The roads were quiet, and the headlights stretched across miles of empty Texas highway. Richard stayed on the phone with me for most of the trip. Neither of us spoke much at first. There are moments in life when silence carries more truth than words ever could. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Your husband knew this day might come," he said. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Even after 7 years, hearing someone speak about Charles still brought a familiar ache to my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked. Richard paused carefully. Charles worried that success would change people, not strangers. Family. I looked out at the darkness beyond the road. The truth was, I had seen the changes myself. They had not happened overnight. They had arrived slowly, one small disappointment at a time. 3 months earlier, Daniel had stopped returning most of my calls. He always had an explanation. Meetings, travel, deadlines. I accepted every excuse because that is what mothers do. We make room for our children's busy lives. Then came missed birthdays, canceled visits, forgotten holidays. Vanessa always seemed to have another plan, another event, another reason why the family could not make time for me. At first, I blamed distance. My ranch sat nearly 80 miles from the city. Later, I blamed age. Perhaps I was becoming too sensitive, too nostalgic, too attached to traditions that younger people no longer valued. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. I remembered a Sunday afternoon 6 weeks earlier. I had driven into town to attend my grandson Ethan's baseball game. I arrived carrying a cooler filled with homemade lemonade and sandwiches. The parking lot was crowded. Parents sat in folding chairs along the fence. I searched for Daniel's family. When I finally found them, Vanessa looked surprised to see me. Not pleased. Surprised. "Nobody told me you were coming," she had said. Her smile never reached her eyes. I stayed for the game anyway. Ethan hit a double into left field and grinned as he stood on second base. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Then afterward, Vanessa announced they already had dinner plans. They left before I could even hand Ethan the brownies I had baked that morning. I ended up driving home with the tray untouched beside me on the passenger seat. At the time, I convinced myself it was nothing. Looking back, I saw it differently. The signs had always been there. Richard's voice brought me back to the present. "Charles updated the documents 3 times before he passed away," he said. Each revision became more specific. "Specific about what?" I asked. "About character," Richard replied quietly. That answer stayed with me for the rest of the drive. Character. Not money. Not business performance. Not titles. Character. By the time I reached the ranch, the moon hung high above the fields. The old white farmhouse stood exactly where it always had, surrounded by oak trees and open land. The porch light glowed warmly against the darkness. Home. Real home. Not a banquet hall. Not a city mansion. Not a room full of people pretending to be family. I parked the truck and sat for a moment before going inside. My phone buzzed. A text message from Daniel appeared on the screen. It contained only 7 words. "Mom, you should not have embarrassed us." I stared at the message for several seconds. Then I set the phone down without replying. For the first time all evening, I felt something unexpected. Not sadness. Not anger. Clarity. Because a son who watched his mother be escorted away and somehow believed she was the one causing embarrassment had revealed more about himself than any argument ever could. And as I stepped onto the porch and unlocked the front door, I realized tomorrow was not going to reveal a secret about money. It was going to reveal the truth about every person involved. I slept very little that night. The house was quiet except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Charles used to wind it every Sunday evening without fail. 7 years had passed since his death, yet the sound still made the house feel occupied. I sat at the kitchen table before sunrise with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands. Outside, the first light spread across the fields. The ranch looked exactly as it had for decades. The fences stretched across open pasture. The barn stood strong against the horizon. The old windmill turned slowly in the morning breeze. People in the city saw this place and assumed it represented a simple life. They were correct about the simplicity. They were wrong about everything else. Around 8 o'clock, Richard arrived. His silver sedan rolled up the gravel driveway and stopped beside the porch. He carried a leather briefcase that I recognized immediately. I had seen it countless times over the years during meetings with Charles. When Richard stepped into the kitchen, he looked older than I remembered. Then again, so did I. He placed the briefcase on the table and sat across from me. Neither of us rushed the conversation. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Better than Daniel would expect," I answered. Richard nodded slowly. "I imagined so." He opened the briefcase and removed several folders. Most were marked with dates from years ago. Some contained signatures. Others carried notes written in Charles's familiar handwriting. Seeing those pages brought back memories of long evenings when my husband sat at this very table discussing responsibility, legacy, and family. He never spoke about wealth with excitement. He spoke about it with caution. He worried about entitlement, Richard said, as if reading my thoughts. Especially after the company became successful. I remembered those conversations. Charles often said that money revealed character faster than hardship ever could. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I wondered if he had been the only person paying attention. Richard slid one particular folder toward me. This is the final revision. I rested my hand on the cover without opening it. Tell me something honestly, I said. Did Charles expect this from Daniel? Richard leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, he considered the question carefully. No, he replied. He worried about influences. He worried about pride. But he always believed Daniel would make the right choice when it mattered most. That answer hurt more than I expected. Because Daniel had been a good son once. I remembered scraped knees and baseball games. I remembered science fairs and college graduations. I remembered a young man who used to drive 2 hours just to help repair a broken fence after a storm. Somewhere along the way, that young man had disappeared. Or perhaps he had simply stopped pretending. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel appeared on the screen. This one was longer. He demanded to know why I had left early. He claimed Vanessa was embarrassed. He insisted that everyone was talking about the scene. Not once did he ask whether I was all right. Not once did he apologize. I set the phone face down on the table. Richard noticed, but said nothing. He did not need to. We both understood. Finally, he closed the folder and looked directly at me. The family meeting is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, he said. Everyone has confirmed attendance. I stared out the window toward the pasture where sunlight now covered the grass in gold. Somewhere beyond those fields, Daniel and Vanessa were probably celebrating what they believed was a victory. They thought the future belonged to them. They thought the story had already ended. But for the first time in months, I felt completely calm. Because tomorrow was not about revenge. It was about truth. And truth has a way of arriving exactly when people become most comfortable with their lies. The rest of that day passed quietly. Richard left shortly before noon, taking the folders with him, but leaving behind a feeling I had not experienced in a long time. Certainty. For months I had questioned myself. I had replayed conversations in my head. I had wondered whether I was imagining the distance growing between me and my family. Now I knew I was not. The evidence was not hidden in legal documents or business records. It was hidden in behavior. The truth had been sitting in plain sight all along. That afternoon, I walked across the ranch the way I often did when I needed to think. The property stretched across nearly 400 acres of rolling pasture and oak trees. Charles loved this land. He used to say that land never pretended to be something it was not. If a fence needed repair, it showed you. If a field needed rain, it showed you. People were different. People smiled while building walls. As I approached the south pasture, I noticed an old wooden bench overlooking the pond. Charles had built it 20 years earlier. I sat there and remembered a conversation we had shortly before he passed away. He had been sitting in this exact spot, staring across the water as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Promise me something, he had said. I remember laughing softly. That depends on what you are about to ask. He smiled. Do not confuse love with permission. At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant. He explained that loving family did not require accepting every insult, every betrayal, or every act of selfishness. He said that too many parents spend their final years excusing behavior they would never tolerate from anyone else. Back then, I thought he was speaking in general terms. Looking back, I wonder if he had already noticed things I refused to see. My phone rang just after 3 o'clock. The screen displayed the name of my granddaughter, Sophie. Unlike most of the family, Sophie still called regularly. She was 21 years old, studying business at a university 2 states away. Grandma, she asked the moment I answered. Her voice sounded nervous. Are you okay? That simple question nearly broke my heart. Because in the middle of all the silence, all the judgment, and all the disappointment, someone had finally asked how I felt. I am fine, sweetheart, I replied. There was a pause. Mom told everyone a different version of what happened. Sophie said carefully. I figured she did. Sophie sighed. Grandma, people are talking. A lot of people thought it was wrong. I stared across the pond as a breeze moved through the tall grass. And what do you think? I asked. Another pause followed. I think somebody wanted to humiliate you. Her honesty made me smile. You always were observant. Sophie lowered her voice. There is something else you should know. Mom and Dad have been acting. Strangely, for weeks. They keep talking about major changes that are coming. My expression hardened slightly. What kind of changes? I'm not sure. But they seem convinced they are about to become very important people. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for a long time. Important people. The phrase echoed in my mind. Daniel and Vanessa clearly believed something was about to happen. They believed they were standing at the beginning of a new chapter. What they did not realize was that tomorrow's meeting was not designed to reward confidence. It was designed to measure character. As evening settled over the ranch, I returned to the farmhouse and prepared a simple dinner. The house felt peaceful. Outside, the sky turned shades of orange and gold. Inside, the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm. Tomorrow afternoon, every member of the family would gather in the same room. Some would arrive expecting celebration. Others would arrive expecting recognition. None of them would arrive expecting the truth. The next morning arrived with the kind of stillness that often comes before a storm. I woke before dawn and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the eastern pasture. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon at the company's headquarters downtown. For nearly 30 years, that building had stood as a symbol of everything Charles worked to create. Thousands of employees had walked through those doors. Families had built lives because of opportunities that began there. Yet somehow, in recent years, Daniel and Vanessa had started speaking about the company as though they alone were responsible for its success. Around 10 o'clock, Richard called to confirm that everyone would be present. His voice remained calm, but I could sense the seriousness beneath it. "They seem very confident," he said. I smiled faintly. Confidence and certainty are not always the same thing. After we ended the call, I prepared for the drive into the city. I chose a simple charcoal gray suit that Charles always liked. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to impress. At my age, appearances mattered far less than character. The drive felt shorter than usual. Perhaps because my mind was unusually clear. I was no longer wondering what would happen. I was simply waiting for everyone else to discover it. When I arrived at the headquarters, the parking lot was already crowded. Expensive vehicles lined the front entrance. Through the glass walls of the building, I could see familiar faces gathering inside. Some were family members. Others were longtime executives who had worked alongside Charles for decades. As I entered the lobby, conversations softened. Several people greeted me warmly. Others looked uncomfortable, likely remembering what had happened at the dinner. News travels quickly in families, especially unpleasant news. Near the elevators, I spotted Daniel and Vanessa. They were standing together speaking with 2 senior managers. Vanessa wore an elegant cream-colored suit and carried herself with unmistakable confidence. Daniel appeared relaxed, almost cheerful. Neither of them expected to see me arrive so early. Vanessa's smile froze for a fraction of a second before returning. "Eleanor," she said pleasantly, "I was not sure you would come." I met her gaze. "This company has been part of my life for a very long time. I would not miss an important meeting." Daniel shifted slightly. "Mom, maybe after today we can talk." It was the first time he had suggested a conversation since the dinner. I noticed he still had not apologized. "Perhaps," I replied. "Nothing more." The conference room occupied the top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. A long polished table stretched through the center of the room. Seats gradually filled as family members and executives took their places. Richard stood near the front reviewing documents. Sophie arrived a few minutes later and quietly took the seat beside me. She squeezed my hand beneath the table. The gesture lasted only a moment, but it reminded me that not every relationship in this family had been damaged. Across the room, Vanessa appeared increasingly excited. She whispered frequently to Daniel. Several times, both glanced toward the chair at the head of the table. The chair Charles once occupied. The chair they clearly believed would soon belong to them. At exactly 2 o'clock, Richard closed the conference room doors. The room fell silent. Papers were arranged. Chairs stopped moving. Every eye turned toward the front. Richard adjusted his glasses and opened the final folder. "Thank you all for attending," he began. "Today we will review the last instructions left by Charles Whitmore regarding ownership, governance, and succession." Vanessa sat up straighter. Daniel folded his hands confidently on the table. Around them, anticipation filled the room. I simply listened. Because unlike everyone else present, I already knew something they did not. The future they had spent months celebrating existed only in their imagination. Richard allowed the silence to settle before continuing. Years of legal work had taught him that important words carried more weight when people were forced to wait for them. Around the conference table, anticipation grew. Vanessa sat with her hands folded neatly in front of her. Daniel leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Richard opened the folder and began reading. The first several pages covered routine matters, financial summaries, governance procedures, long-standing company policies. Nothing unexpected. Several executives nodded along as they listened. Vanessa exchanged a glance with Daniel that suggested impatience. They were waiting for the part that mattered. Finally, Richard turned another page. His voice became more deliberate. Several years before his passing, Charles Whitmore established a succession structure designed to ensure that leadership would remain in the hands of individuals who demonstrated integrity, stewardship, and commitment to family values. A few people shifted in their seats. Vanessa straightened slightly. Richard continued. Ownership and voting authority would not transfer automatically through inheritance alone. Instead, all candidates would be subject to review under conditions specified by Charles Whitmore. The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel frowned for the first time. This was clearly not what he expected to hear. Richard continued. Reading. The review process included evaluations from company leadership, community involvement records, and documented treatment of family members. Those final words seemed to linger in the air. Treatment of family members. Across the table, one executive lowered his eyes toward the documents in front of him. Another adjusted his glasses. Nobody spoke. Richard turned another page. Charles Whitmore believed that character revealed itself most clearly when power appeared within reach. Vanessa's confident smile began to fade. Daniel leaned forward. What exactly does that mean? He asked. Richard looked up calmly. It means your father created standards that extend beyond financial performance. Daniel's expression tightened. And who decides whether those standards are met? Richard closed the folder for a moment. The review committee designated by Charles. A murmur spread through the room. Several family members exchanged uncertain looks. Vanessa spoke before anyone else could. Surely this is just a formality. Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened another document and placed it on the table. No, he said quietly. It is not a formality. For the first time since entering the building, I saw a genuine concern appear on Vanessa's face. Daniel looked toward me briefly, then away again. It was a small moment, but I noticed it. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he was beginning to realize that the future he imagined might not exist. Richard continued. The review process was completed last week. The room froze. Every eye focused on him. Vanessa's posture stiffened. Daniel sat perfectly still. Sophie glanced toward me, then back toward Richard. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Richard lifted a single envelope from the folder. It carried Charles's signature across the seal. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Seeing it there felt strangely comforting. Even after all these years, Charles seemed to be guiding events from beyond the reach of time. Richard held the envelope carefully. The findings of the committee and the final instructions of Charles Whitmore are contained within this document. Vanessa swallowed visibly. Daniel's confidence had disappeared completely now. The executives along the far side of the table remained silent. They knew what was coming. Some had participated in the review themselves. Others had likely seen portions of the results. Only Daniel and Vanessa appeared unaware. Richard rested the envelope on the table. Before I read the final determination, he said, there is one additional statement from Charles that must be entered into the record. He unfolded a handwritten page and began reading aloud. If those who seek leadership first seek status, they are not ready. If those who seek authority first seek recognition, they are not ready. And if those who cannot honor the people who built the foundation wish to inherit the structure above it, they are certainly not ready. Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than before. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Vanessa turned her head toward me. For the first time, she was not looking at me with superiority. She was looking at me with uncertainty. And uncertainty, I knew, was only the beginning. Richard broke the silence by opening the envelope. The sound of paper unfolding seemed unusually loud inside the conference room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the city skyline beyond the windows appeared frozen. Richard adjusted his glasses and began reading. Following a comprehensive review conducted under the authority granted by Charles Whitmore, the committee has reached its final determination. Vanessa's fingers tightened around a pen resting on the table. Daniel stared straight ahead. The committee found repeated evidence of conduct inconsistent with the values required for succession. A murmur moved through the room. Richard continued. The findings include documented attempts to isolate family members, misuse of influence for personal advancement, patterns of disrespect toward individuals holding senior family status, and behavior demonstrating a lack of stewardship. Vanessa suddenly leaned forward. This is ridiculous, she said. What evidence? Richard calmly turned a page. The committee reviewed witness statements from family members, employees, community leaders, and independent advisors over a period of several years. Vanessa's face lost color. Daniel looked from Richard to the executives seated along the wall. Several refused to meet his eyes. Others appeared deeply uncomfortable. They had known. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Richard continued reading. Because the standards established by Charles Whitmore were not satisfied, neither Daniel Whitmore nor Vanessa Whitmore shall assume executive control, voting authority, or succession leadership under the terms of this agreement. The room fell completely silent. Daniel blinked several times as if he had misunderstood the words. Vanessa stared at Richard. That cannot be right, she said. There must be some mistake. Richard simply handed her a copy of the document. Her eyes moved rapidly across the page. With each line, her expression changed. Confidence became confusion. Confusion became disbelief. Across the table, Sophie lowered her gaze. She looked sad rather than surprised. Daniel finally found his voice. Then who receives control? He asked. Richard folded his hands. Charles anticipated that question. He reached for another document. Under the succession framework, leadership authority remains vested in the primary trustee and majority voting shareholder until a qualified successor is approved. Daniel frowned. And who is that? Richard looked directly toward me. Every head in the room turned. Some people smiled softly. Others appeared relieved. Vanessa's eyes widened. Daniel stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. Eleanor Whitmore remains the majority voting shareholder and primary trustee, Richard said. The words settled over the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Nobody gasped. Nobody shouted. The truth simply arrived. Quiet. Unavoidable. Final. Daniel sat back slowly in his chair. Mom, he said. The single word sounded strange coming from him now. Not because of anger. Because of uncertainty. For months he had spoken to me as though I were becoming irrelevant. Now he was forced to confront a reality he had never bothered to investigate. I met his gaze calmly. Your father believed responsibility should be earned, I said. Vanessa pushed back her chair slightly. You knew? She asked. You knew all along? I considered the question. I knew enough. The room remained silent. Nobody rushed to defend her. Nobody rushed to challenge me. The facts spoke for themselves. Richard opened the final page. There is one additional instruction from Charles Whitmore. Everyone turned back toward him. He began reading. If Eleanor determines that a future successor has demonstrated integrity, humility, and respect for family, she may personally approve that individual for leadership consideration. Daniel lowered his eyes. Vanessa said nothing. The future they had expected was gone. Not because someone had taken it away, because they had failed to qualify for it. And for the first time since entering the conference room, I realized the meeting was no longer about inheritance. It was about consequences. Nobody moved for several seconds. The conference room seemed suspended in time. Outside the windows, traffic continued through the city below, but inside that room, everything had changed. Daniel stared at the documents in front of him as though reading them again might somehow produce a different outcome. Vanessa remained unusually quiet. The confidence she had carried into the meeting had vanished completely. Richard organized the remaining papers and placed them back into the folder. His work was finished. The truth had been delivered. What happened next belonged to the people sitting around that table. One of the senior executives cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore, he said respectfully, looking toward me. The board would like to know how you wish to proceed. It was a simple question, yet I could feel everyone waiting for the answer. Vanessa looked at me carefully. Daniel did the same. Perhaps they expected anger. Perhaps they expected humiliation. After all, that was the language they understood best. I folded my hands on the table and considered the question. The company will continue exactly as Charles intended, I said. Several executives nodded. Relief appeared on a few faces. Stability mattered. Employees depended on it. Families depended on it. The company had never been about one person's ambition. It had always been about responsibility. Daniel finally spoke. Mom, I know things have been difficult. The words sounded awkward, unpracticed, as though he had only just realized how much time had passed since he last treated me like family. I listened without interrupting. There have been misunderstandings, he continued, and maybe mistakes. Maybe. The word lingered in the air. Not certainty, not accountability. Maybe. I looked at him calmly. Your father spent his entire life teaching that character is revealed by choices, not explanations. Daniel lowered his eyes. Across the table, Sophie remained silent. She watched everything carefully. Unlike many others in the room, she seemed less interested in power than in understanding. Vanessa straightened in her chair. So what happens now? She asked. There was no challenge in her voice anymore. Only uncertainty. Richard answered before I could. The succession process remains open. Future consideration is possible if the standards established by Charles Whitmore are satisfied. Vanessa absorbed the information slowly. For the first time, she realized that nothing had been permanently promised. Leadership was not an entitlement. It was a responsibility that had to be earned. One by one, family members began speaking. Some offered support. Others expressed surprise at details they had never known. Several executives shared stories about Charles that reminded everyone why the company existed in the first place. As the conversation continued, I noticed something interesting. Nobody talked about money anymore. Nobody talked about titles. Nobody talked about status. The discussion had shifted entirely toward trust, toward values, toward the kind of people they wanted leading the future. Hours earlier, Daniel and Vanessa had entered the building believing they were about to inherit authority. Now they were being forced to confront a more difficult question. Had they actually earned it? Eventually, the meeting came to an end. Chairs moved. Documents were collected. People began leaving the room in small groups. Sophie walked beside me toward the elevator. Grandpa would be proud of you, she said quietly. I smiled. Your grandfather cared more about people than most ever realized. As the elevator doors opened, I glanced back toward the conference room. Daniel remained seated at the table. Vanessa sat beside him. Neither appeared angry. Neither appeared victorious. For the first time in a very long while, they appeared thoughtful. And as I stepped into the elevator, I realized something important. The greatest consequence was never losing power. The greatest consequence was being forced to see yourself clearly. 3 weeks passed before Daniel came to the ranch. I was repairing a section of fence near the north pasture when I noticed his truck approaching along the gravel road. He stepped out slowly and stood beside the gate for a moment, as though he was unsure whether he belonged there anymore. In some ways, that uncertainty was understandable. The last time we had truly spoken as mother and son felt very far away. I finished securing the fence wire before walking toward him. Neither of us rushed the conversation. The afternoon sun hung low above the fields, and a warm breeze moved through the grass. Finally, Daniel spoke. I owe you an apology. The words were simple. There was no speech prepared in advance. No excuses. No explanations. Just the truth. I looked at him quietly. Yes, I said. He nodded. I spent so much time worrying about what I thought I deserved that I stopped paying attention to how I was treating people. His voice carried a heaviness I had not heard before. Especially you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked across the ranch. Dad used to bring me out here when I was a kid. I smiled faintly. You hated repairing fences. Daniel laughed softly. I hated all of it. The heat. The work. The early mornings. He paused. Now I think those were some of the best days of my life. We walked back toward the farmhouse together. Inside, I poured 2 glasses of iced tea. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm in the hallway. The same rhythm that had marked decades of birthdays, holidays, celebrations, and difficult conversations. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room. I spent years thinking success meant becoming important, he admitted. But Dad already told us what mattered. I just stopped listening. I noticed that he never blamed Vanessa. He never blamed circumstances. For the first time, he accepted responsibility for his own choices. That mattered more than any apology. As for Vanessa, I saw her only once during those weeks. She requested a meeting and arrived at the ranch one Saturday morning. The conversation was brief. She admitted she had become obsessed with appearances, status, and control. She acknowledged that she had treated me unfairly. I appreciated her honesty. Forgiveness, however, is not the same as forgetting. Trust returns slowly, one decision at a time. By autumn, the company was thriving. The board remained stable. Employees continued their work. The crisis everyone feared never arrived because the company had never depended on one person's ambition. It depended on principles. The same principles Charles spent his life trying to protect. Several months later, Sophie joined the company as part of a leadership development program. She worked harder than anyone expected and asked more questions than anyone else. Most importantly, she listened. One afternoon, she visited the ranch and sat beside me on the old bench overlooking the pond. "Grandma," she said, "do you think Grandpa knew all of this would happen?" I thought about the question carefully. The water reflected the golden light of sunset. Birds moved across the distant trees. Finally, I smiled. I think he understood people very well. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. We sat there quietly for a while. The peace felt earned. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson had nothing to do with money, inheritance, or corporate control. The real lesson was much simpler. Respect cannot be demanded. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be inherited. It is built through daily choices, through humility, through character, and through the way we treat people when we believe they have nothing left to offer us. The night I was asked to leave that dinner table, many people assumed I had lost something valuable. The truth was exactly the opposite. That night revealed who everyone truly was. And once the truth is visible, you no longer need revenge. The truth does all the work for you.